me. First time visiting the LSE in a professional capacity, but it's one of those bucket list things for a philosopher, so I'm really happy to get to do it. I want to start us in 1976. Let's see. Uh-oh. My slide.
Great tech. I think
This has to get onto.
Yeah, we used to get back onto this morning.
Clever.
Am I on?
Nice.
Yeah,
you
That looks good.
It
Okay.
should now work there.
Perfect. Okay, so 1976, this new arcade game called Death Race had recently come out, and a psychologist named Gerard Dreesen weighed in on a controversy about it. In the New York Times, he's quoted as saying, "In this game, a player takes the first step to creating violence. The player is no longer just a spectator, he's an actor in the process." And really, ever since then, the world has been arguing whether there's some causal link between playing violent video games and then actually committing acts of violence or becoming more aggressive. So as part of that debate, researchers have generated hundreds of studies on this question. Do you become more violent if you play violent video games? And some of them have found a connection and other ones have not. That's not really surprising. You do a bunch of scientific studies on something, there's going to be variation, you'll find different answers. So as long as researchers can do evidence synthesis the right way, they should be able to sift through varying results and figure out signal from noise. If you talk to experts on the subject, most of them will tell you that in a case like this, the best kind of evidence synthesis is a tool called meta-analysis. That's a term for using statistical techniques to amalgamate or aggregate evidence that was actually coined in 1976 by a statistician named Gene Glass. So same year, Death Race was released. The promise of meta-analysis, not everyone believes in the promise, but the promise is that it's a rigorous and objective method for combining and analyzing the results of different studies. So it should be a superior way of resolving debates about what the evidence really says. Of course, it won't surprise you to hear this hasn't happened in the case of violent video game research, and that's because the meta-analyses disagree. So not only the primary studies, but the meta-analyses as well. Some find no link between aggression and video games. Others say there's compelling evidence for a causal link. And it's not just the case of violent video games. Conflict among meta-analyses is actually really common in any area where researchers are studying the effectiveness of an intervention, whether that's in conservation biology or in medicine or in psychology, really anywhere at all, you'll find the same thing. You'll find meta-analyses that give you results that disagree. So that's potentially a problem. If the point of meta-analysis is to help us settle disagreements about the effectiveness of interventions, and then they just somehow reproduce or recapitulate those same disagreements, it's really not great. So people have recognized this, and even though the orthodoxy is meta-analysis is the best way to answer this kind of question, there's a growing set of critical voices that argue you can't do a meta-analysis without making a lot of judgment calls that could be reasonably made differently. In fact, in real life, researchers make those judgment calls differently. That explains why the analyses come to different conclusions. So for these people, there's some kind of arbitrariness to meta-analysis that just can't be eliminated. The defenders of meta-analysis, they have a few lines of response. They will say first that a lot of the disagreement among meta-analyses is down to researchers just doing them badly, using bad methods, so we could get rid of a lot of the problems that way. They will say, secondly, that those arbitrary judgment calls aren't so common, the significance of them is overblown, the results of studies really turn on them. And then finally, they'll say the statistical methods are improving. So maybe now it looks like using statistical measure A or B, it's sort of an arbitrary choice, or there's good reasons on both sides. But as we go on, we can find out that in this sort of context, this is the measure you should use. In that sort of context, that's the measure you should use. So it's a problem that's sort of going to be solved in the normal case of getting better at using this kind of method. I'm introducing this debate not because I actually want to take one side or the other, but because I want to highlight something that I think both the defenders and the critics of meta-analysis are getting wrong. So they're both responding to the same problem, conflicting meta-analyses, and in their response, they're making a common assumption, which is this, that the core epistemic contribution, the thing meta-analysis is good for as an epistemic tool, is to tell us what the evidence really says about the existence and the magnitude of the causal relationships of interest. So it's typically these interventions that we want to study. But it's a bit more general than that. Any sort of causal relationship can fit the bill. So does violent video games lead to more aggressive behavior? If so, by how much? That's the paradigmatic meta-analysis question. That's the paradigmatic thing it should help us be good at resolving. So that's the assumption, widely accepted, rarely defended, that I want to target in the talk. I'm going to argue that even though it's true that this is the most common use of meta-analysis, that we don't want to read the core epistemic contribution off of its most common use, and in fact, a better epistemology of meta-analysis would see the core contribution as this, that what it does is help us explore and understand variation among populations of studies. I think there's a lot of practical benefits to taking this view, so I think it's right, but more than that, by the end of the talk, I will get to three ways to apply lessons, 3 ways to reorient the way that we think about and practice meta-analysis, reorient the epistemology of meta-analysis by adopting this view. So basically, if I'm right, the current way of judging a meta-analysis by asking how good it is at getting us to a single estimate of the effect that variable X has on variable Y is, I'm sorry if this is too American a reference, but it's like judging a subcompact SUV by how good it is at like towing a trailer. You might do that sometimes, but that's not. I don't know. It really kills with some audiences. Fill in your own metaphor here.
We've only got about 45 minutes, so I wouldn't explain all the details.
Right? Okay, so I will proceed as follows. I want to trace a little bit of the history, the emergence and the ascendance of meta-analysis as a method. Then I'll sort of give the justification for this standard story encapsulated on the top here. And then I'm going to switch and tell this second story, this alternate epistemology. And we'll end with why this matters, 3 practical lessons. So, meta-analysis is a term. It's nearing its 50th birthday, but the essential technique's a lot older. It goes back at least to 1904. A statistician named Carl Pearson aggregated a bunch of data sets to look at the effect of inoculating soldiers against typhoid. Let's see, am I playing music? No, there we go. And then throughout the 20th century, statisticians, big deal statisticians like the William Cochrans and Ronald Fishers of the world were drawn to the problem. So by the time we get to this 1976 paper by Jean Glass, there's a really strong methodological and theoretical foundation to go along with the new name. This paper by Glass is actually really rich. It gives a lot of insight into what motivated the development of meta-analysis, the kind of problem that its creators hoped it would solve. So one thing he says is, we're inundated with information. Our problem is to find the knowledge in the information. So it's not unusual, as you all know, for there to be dozens or hundreds or thousands of studies on a scientific question. Glass is a statistician, but also a researcher in educational psychology. So he's giving examples from his field, 400 studies on the effect of television instruction, 900 studies looking at response bias in surveys. And he describes these findings as mute on their own. He says someone must read them and discover what they say. But that's not easy. Why not? Let's imagine we've got a group of researchers. They want to know how fast is Arctic sea ice melting. So they'll do some study. They'll measure sea ice thickness at a lot of different places over a lot of different time. They might take thousands, hundreds of thousands of measurements. They could take so many measurements. But no matter how many measurements they take, it's still a subset of all the measurements possibly that they could have taken, right? So because of that, even if their sample is really large and the conclusion of their study is pretty close to the actual rate of Arctic sea ice melt, pretty unlikely it'll hit on it exactly. If a second group of researchers does the exact same study, they are also likely to get a pretty good estimate, but because they're going to be working with a slightly different sample of all the possible measurements that could have been taken, even if we hold fixed everything else about the study setup, the design, and that kind of thing, you're likely to get 2 estimates that are a little bit different from each other. And in reality, one of those estimates will probably be closer to the truth than the other one, but not because one study is better than the other, just as an artifact of sampling. So that's what statisticians call random variation due to sampling rather than differences in quality or methodology. And then of course we have the other side of this, non-random variation. So you can imagine the more likely scenario where 2 teams of people studying the same question about sea ice melt have different protocols for how to take measurements, or they use different equipment. And so factors like that will introduce this further kind of non-random variation that's due to systematic differences among studies. So these are both permanent features of science. Nobody thinks we're going to get rid of them. Even if nobody ever did any bad research, we'd still be dealing with this kind of variation. There's no such thing as a perfect study. There's no one uniquely best set of methodological choices. So the volume in and the variation of the products of science that's generated by precisely this kind of thing forces us to develop what Glass calls methods for the orderly summarization of studies. And that's what goes by the term evidence synthesis today. We don't want evidence synthesis to be reading widely and reporting one's impressions of the phenomenon, right? If only because the impressions that different people get when they read widely might vary as much as the original studies themselves. They're not very constrained. So in an effort to avoid that, something like meta-analysis, could only approximate this, but hopes to be more like a simple arithmetic operation, even though it's not simple, it's complicated. But you want, no matter who does the study, to basically get the same result, or as close to it as you can, as opposed to like a vibes we all read and we all kind of come away with some basic idea of what might be going on. So if you're Gene Glass or many other statisticians, that's a data analysis issue. So just as statistical methods take us from thousands of individual measurements of sea ice to an overall estimate of the rate of melt, so too can they take us from multiple such estimates to the estimate of the estimates, right? It's all in the name. And that estimate, one that's more trustworthy than any individual one, for the same general reasons that many measurements are better than one. That just is the methodological essence of meta-analysis. I'll say just a little bit more about how you would actually run an analysis like this. First, you need to pick a question. That's actually quite difficult. You have to pick a question that's answerable based on the kinds of primary studies that are already out there. So lots of constraints on the sort of question that's sort of tractable if you're using meta-analytic methods. But say you do that, then you're going to look for all of the primary studies that would be relevant to, all the ones that address that question. So you'll search widely, you'll include as many things as you possibly can, but then you'll go and cull the pool. So you want to make sure there's quality control. You'll rule out studies that are really bad. You will make sure that the primary studies are similar enough to each other that they can be meaningfully compared. So a lot of decisions go on in that process. Once you have your pool of primary studies chosen, you are going to convert the results of each of those primary studies into a common metric that's called an effect size. So, for example, a meta-analysis that asks how effective different ecosystem restoration techniques are in helping a forest recover from logging might include some studies that measure recovery in terms like tree growth, the rate of tree growth or the amount of new trees. And it might include other studies that look at the total number of species in the forest. So we've got these different measurements, tree growth, species in the forest. It'll convert those into some kind of common currency. In that particular case, a common thing to use is the ratio of the actual result, either the tree growth or the number of species, to the desired result. And so even though the studies are looking at different things, you can use that ratio as some kind of common effect size. Then, once you've done that conversion, you can pool it all together. You do some complicated statistics. The details really shouldn't matter for anything we're talking about here today. But you combine them all and you get, at the end of the day, two primary outputs. First one's called the meta-analytic mean. That's the estimate of the estimates. And the second one is called a heterogeneity statistic. That's a measure of how much of the variation among the study results is non-random. In practice, people will treat the meta-analytic mean as the headline, the thing we wanted to know. And then the heterogeneity statistic as a way of thinking about how accurate the meta-analytic mean is. So high heterogeneity means we're not as willing to trust the meta-analytic mean, or it's just maybe not quite as good. Low heterogeneity is better. That's not how I want us to think about it, but that's pretty standard, pretty typical. Okay, so that summarizes the approach to evidence synthesis. It's become very, very influential over the last several decades through the following path. Meta-analysis was associated with evidence-based medicine since the mid-90s. So evidence-based medicine starts from the pretty sensible idea that clinical decisions should be made on the best evidence. Nobody can disagree with that. But then you add this substantive idea that the best evidence is sorted out according to a hierarchy, and the thing at the top of the hierarchy is a meta-analysis. So that setup becomes influential in evidence-based medicine, and then the wider world, the evidence-based policy movement sort of applies similar ideas to a wide range of domains, to education, to international development, to conservation biology. And so along with it, this picture of meta-analysis, this epistemic authority of meta-analysis gets carried out much more broadly, not just in research, but in all kinds of policy and other institutional settings and contexts. So that's the history. Let's think about the justification. What would support this kind of practice? What's the standard story behind that? So the standard story says, out of a range of varying answers to questions like how much does tree planting affect forest recovery after logging, or what effect does inoculation for typhoid have on soldiers, we can get a single answer that's unbiased if we use a meta-analysis, meaning the result doesn't depend very much on the person who conducts it. That's what we want. That's what's supposed to happen. That's the goal, that's the point. So I hope, well, if that story seems obvious to you, you're in very good company. It has to many scientists who have written about meta-analysis. So there's lively debates, I kind of mentioned this in the beginning, about how successful meta-analysis is, but those debates proceed from this shared idea about what success looks like from this standard story. So I really want to motivate the idea that this standard story is entrenched. So I'll give you a few quick examples, one from a scientist, one from science journalism, and one from philosophy to show you that this is the going view in case anyone is skeptical. So if you look at scholarly guides for how to do a meta-analysis to researchers in various disciplines, you'll see something like this. This is pretty typical of the genre. So these authors say, the primary aim of many meta-analyses is to produce a more accurate estimate of the effect of a particular intervention or group of interventions than is possible using only a single study. Standard, typical. This is a slightly more pithy way of saying it. It's a way to deal with varying results. I think that's my favorite short expression of what people want out of a meta-analysis. The video game example, has taken off, become the subject of controversy in science reporting at various times throughout the years. So fairly recently, 2018, this science journalist kind of wrote about the video game case and used it as an example of this broader debate about meta-analysis. He says much the same thing, right? He says, a meta-analysis is a statistical method to combine the results of several studies and come to a single conclusion. But it's not just the non-philosophers. I think philosophers are sort of signing on to, implicitly, this standard story as well. So I'll take as an example here Jacob Stigenga. He's one of the more prominent critics of meta-analysis, and in his most famous paper introducing this problem of arbitrary for meta-analysis, he says, a free goal of using meta-analysis is to discover causal relationships and to determine the magnitude of an effect for a particular magnitude of a purported cause. So Jacob is careful, right? He doesn't say that's the only thing meta-analysis is good for, but all of his subsequent critiques of meta-analysis are framed in terms of its failure to meet this goal. There's no other goals really explicitly considered. And I actually, 3 or 4 years ago, wrote a paper about meta-analysis where I said much the same thing. So really, this talk is living up to another philosopher's dream, which is to argue against one's previous self. So I'm now about to explain to everyone why I was wrong, but now I figured it out. Now I've got it right. And I don't think I have identified some novel idea. I see myself as identifying a sort of shadowy counterpart. Sociologists call it a second story about what meta-analysis is good for that's just been overlooked, and trying to rehabilitate it and bring it into the spotlight so that in philosophy, at least, we can get the epistemology of meta-analysis right. So let's move to that second story now. I said this at the beginning, that just because there's a predominant use of a tool doesn't mean that it's its best purpose. I think there's ample precedent for that idea in history of philosophy or philosophy of science. it would be really bad theory of experiment or a bad epistemology of experiment to say what experiments are good for is testing hypotheses, and that's it. Even if that's what most experiments do, we know that there are a lot of other important things about experiments other than testing hypotheses, and if we want an epistemology of experiment, we need to identify something broader in order to capture these other uses. So I'm going to argue in the same way. I'm going to look at studies in ecology and evolution because they're my favorite sciences, but also because they happen to showcase uses of meta-analysis that depart from the second story. And by looking at that, we can sort of build up what this alternate or depart from the standard story, build up this second story of meta-analysis. So I'm going to go in on one case study, and I'll ask you to take my word for it, that it's representative of a lot of other work that uses meta-analysis in the kind of ways I'm trying to illustrate. But it's better to just go all in on describing one case study. And the case study will be the story of the latitudinal diversity gradient, which is something that world travelers interested in ecology have known since at least the 19th century. They've observed that the closer you are to the equator, or 0 degrees latitude, the higher the number of species you'll see. And then as you get closer to the poles, you will see lower numbers of species, decline of species richness. So ever since observing this, scientists have been hypothesizing reasons why this might be the case. There's sort of a class of biological explanations. There's a class of non-biological explanations. But even though everyone had a sneaking suspicion that there really was this gradient, and it might even be global or general, nobody really knew for sure until 2004, because while there were hundreds of studies on this kind of a gradient, they just covered partial transects of the globe, or they only looked at a limited number of species. So this changes a couple decades ago when this ecologist, Heinrich Hillebrand, conducted a meta-analysis of 600 published estimates of the gradient. So for each of these, he calculates 2 effect sizes. He looks at the strength of the relationship between diversity and latitude, and he looks at the slope of the relationship between diversity and latitude. He also, this will be important later, he looks at moderator variables that might affect that relationship. So he looks at 14 different ones, things like body mass, longitude, whether the primary study was conducted at a regional or local scale. I'll show you more of them in a little bit. And then he uses these results to investigate 2 things: how general is the gradient, because that was sort of suspected but unknown, and then secondly, to think about hypotheses relevant to what might cause it. So I'll talk about each of these one by one. So on the question of the generality, he says, the latitudinal decline of diversity is a ubiquitous phenomenon. So like negative relationships mean we have a gradient in this case because equator's at 0 degrees. So overall, he finds significant relationships, negative strength and slope across the complete database. So that's a figure from the paper. It doesn't really matter, just be like, he found the result you would think if there really was a latitudinal diversity gradient. But notice here that we've already departed from the standard story about meta-analysis. And that's because we're not actually looking at a cause-effect relationship between 2 variables. So the idea isn't latitude causes species richness to go up or down. What he wants to do here is just look at the structure of a relationship between 2 variables and then further think about what might be the causes of these things. So we're looking at something other than what the standard story tells you meta-analysis is supposed to look for. The other thing here, so what the meta-analysis allowed him to accomplish that other studies didn't let him to do, he was able to detect this trend, right? So the trend detecting, he says, all right, we have this general relationship, but it's not a uniform gradient. So there's all kinds of variation, right? Depending on all kinds of things, we're not looking at the same or nearly the same strength and slope in every single primary study. High heterogeneity, significant variation in all of these different gradient parameters. So this gets us to another way in which we're departing from the standard story about meta-analysis. On the standard story, The inference pattern one uses is roughly this. You have a good meta-analysis, whatever that's supposed to be, whatever it means to conduct a good one, and you have low heterogeneity, then the effect size is a good guide to the magnitude of the phenomenon you're thinking about. That's not what happens in this case. Essentially, the heterogeneity statistic is really high for this kind of study. It doesn't really matter because he's not trying to figure out the magnitude of a causal relationship, right? He's just trying to understand, is there some general trend? So the inference pattern looks more like a good meta-analysis plus high heterogeneity. Okay, the effect size suggests that the phenomenon of interest is a general one. So already we can have multiple different ways of reasoning, and they might use the different outputs or components, outputs of a meta-analysis in different ways. One more point about this study. So we're now, kind of transitioning from this idea of identifying a trend to seeing a lot of heterogeneity in the trend. That is important in its own right. So, well, real quick, I said this is representative of a lot of other work, so a couple other pretty important influential papers that have used similar methods to identify some general trend where it didn't matter so much that we were zeroing in on a particular causal relationship, looking at a fingerprint of climate change impacts across systems, and looking at declines in Caribbean corals. So these both had like the effect of stitching together studies that were more limited in scope and allowing us to say something more general about a relationship. Okay, so you've seen this slide already, but I want to draw our attention back to the underlined section now where Hillebrand characterized the gradients, the effect sizes from every study with respect to all these additional variables, like looking at moderator variables. Basically looking if you see interesting covariation in primary relationship and then all these other different potential variables. So this is another figure from the paper, and again, we don't need to worry about the details. The thick lines are indicating the strength of the relationship, and obviously that the angle is looking at the slope, but these are all of the kinds of moderator relationships that he looked at here. And I just want to talk about a couple ways in which they turned out to be really theoretically interesting, turned out to contribute something to the general issue or the general question in a way that is also departing from the standard story. So first thing you'll see, let's see, not sure which one of these it is, but anyway, the latitudinal gradient is both stronger and steeper if you look at it at a regional scale compared to a local scale. So that's a discovery of this work. It turns out then to act as a piece of evidence against an entire family of hypotheses about the causes of the gradient. So hypotheses that are about biological processes like competition are sort of thinking about local scales. Seeing that you have a difference between the regional and the local scales tells against that whole family of hypotheses. So a way to generate evidence that speaks to a causal hypothesis that is in itself identifying a causal relationship. Secondly, this was a result that Hillebrand found kind of surprising, that trophic scale really matters. Let's see. Yeah, the strength of the gradient is much stronger for organisms at a high trophic level. So that does something, yet again, a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily speak for or against existing hypotheses, but it reveals a previously unknown relationship. So he says an unprecedented result was a strong relation of the regional gradient to trophic level. Doesn't allow Hillebrand to say anything about the causes of that relationship, but it suggests a new phenomenon for investigation. And people have considered, I think these are ones that Hillebrand entertains in the piece, the original piece. Oh, this could be because of ecological interactions between trophic levels. It could be because there's some positively reinforced correlation between diversity and adjacent trophic levels, or it could have something to do with statistical patterns of the food web itself. But people have subsequently studied these things. So there's papers as recently as 2021 continuing to follow up on this. So it's sort of an idea generating or a hypothesis generating function of a meta-analysis, which is also totally not something you see on the standard story. Okay. I'll say, yeah, so one more thing about this. I think I've tried to pull out, okay, you can detect trends. That involves a different sort of inference pattern where high heterogeneity isn't a bad thing. And then this exploring different moderator variables and having that sort of suggest causal hypotheses for future research. I'll just use a toy example to try to explain a little bit more clearly how that might look. So we're done on the diversity gradient, but here's my toy example. Maybe you're asking a question like, does the diversity of fish species in a lake decline as the lake gets deeper? A bunch of studies on it. You do a meta-analysis. Oh no, heterogeneity is high, which means there's all this non-random variation from lake to lake and study to study. Is that bad? Can you not learn anything interesting? Oh, you might learn something very interesting. You can look for correlates of effect sizes. For example, you could say, is the rate at which diversity declines with depth correlated with the size of the lake? You look for that, maybe you find it is, maybe you find it isn't. If you find it is, then that can suggest, again, future research, right? That's the basic idea. So you see it in the first example, but I think this is a little bit of a cleaner way maybe of explaining how it can all go down. It suggests that sometimes the interesting result might not be the meta-analytic mean. The heterogeneity statistic or aspects of that might really be the interesting result, and we should be open to that. Okay, so case study done. Now we'll go to the second story. And I think what I like, I want to go back to this idea. I said I liked it already, the idea that a meta-analysis is a way to deal with varying results. So I think that's just a great phrase. It expresses the frustration, right, of having too much evidence but also not enough. And it expresses the ambiguity, that there are different ways to deal with varying results. And in essence, the second story I'm advocating for is a different way of dealing with them. So here's how I want to think about it. Whereas a standard story is sort of trying to explain away variation, the second story is explaining it rather than explaining it away. I think that's the key difference. One more thing I'll say about this. So of course, meta-analysis, it's just a form of statistics. The focus of statistical analysis are data. The distinctive thing about meta-analysis is that the data in question are study results, which are themselves composed of data points. So just as data sets are samples of larger populations of measurements researchers could have taken, study results are samples of larger populations of studies researchers could have conducted. And just as the primary analysis of data allows us, under the right conditions, to make inferences about characteristics of the population of measurements from which data are sampled, the meta-analysis of a study lets us make inferences about the characteristics of the population of studies from which they are sampled. What does that then do for you? Ultimately, we want to make inferences about phenomena in the world, right? But I'm introducing sort of an extra step along the way, because the thing we're learning about are the populations of studies in a meta-analysis. Then it's a further question how we would reason from what we know about variation in the population of studies to how we would reason about the phenomena of interest in the world. And this point is very well appreciated when the data in question are measurements, right? We have this famous data versus phenomena distinction from Bogan and Woodward. I just think it's easy to sort of get lost and not see that as much when we're talking about meta-analysis, that we aren't directly making inferences about the phenomena because we're talking about primary studies as the data points, right? But there is still this extra thing we have to do in order to make inferences about phenomena. So I'm not saying we can't use meta-analysis to learn about natural phenomena. We absolutely can, but it's just not because meta-analytic results are about phenomena. They aren't. That's the move that requires further inferences. And then, most importantly, which inferences are appropriate and which conclusions we can actually reach depends on how the populations of studies vary. And that's why we want to say the core epistemic contribution of meta-analysis is helping us understand how the populations of studies vary, because that's the key thing that matters in making further inferences. So I am very indebted to ecologists and evolutionary biologists for helping me see this point. I sometimes talk to statisticians about this paper or give this talk to them, and sometimes they'll want to say, we knew this all along. You know, maybe they did, I don't know. But I came to it through understanding how this kind of stuff is being used in the case of ecology and evolutionary biology. And there's this nice exuberance in the way these people talk about it that I thought is worth putting up here. So here's a paper. These people are talking about it. There's a lot of jargony language about statistics. And then they're like, then a whole new world to explore that was hidden when we only focused on significance testing in the original studies. So they're very excited about effect sizes as opposed to just looking for statistical significance in a study. More on that later. This one, more recently, Cooper and collaborators. For yesterday's synthesis, the variation among studies was a nuisance. For today's synthesis, variety is the spice of life. And then last, real biological processes can drive effect heterogeneity. This is the stuff that gets us up every morning. So this is the kind of enthusiasm I'm drawing on and trying to build an alternative and better epistemology of meta-analysis here. Notice how different this is from, I'll give you on the next slide a quote, it's almost 10 years old, by Leonidas. I'm never sure I'm saying his name right. You know this already, we've kind of covered it. But what he has to say about meta-analyses is much more pessimistic, especially when they involve high heterogeneity. He says, even when systematic reviews and meta-analyses are well done, have none of the problems mentioned above, kind of a laundry list of typical problems you might mention, most may still not be informative. A very common conclusion, in particular for meta-analyses of randomized trials, is that the evidence is weak or insufficient. Thus, the review is not informative on what the best interventions are in terms of patient care or health policy. So I mean, this might be the right thing to say about certain meta-analyses with certain purposes, but it's just the wrong thing to say about meta-analysis in general for all the reasons that I've been giving you throughout the talk. And I think this is sort of a real typical kind of skepticism about meta-analyses that even people who you might think are really behind the method would express. And it's that kind of skepticism that I think is motivating reorienting the philosophy of meta-analysis. So we can see this broader set of contributions meta-analysis might make once we adopt this idea that the core purpose is explaining variation in populations of studies. And I'll turn now to kind of how, when it comes to pursuing an epistemology of meta-analysis, we might reorient or we might do better so as not to sort of end up in this kind of place here, which I think is worth avoiding. So I want to hit on 3 lessons. It's going to be a little programmatic because this is where there's a whole new opportunity for people to do interesting work, and I just want to motivate it for you, not say too much more about it. So I'll wrap up kind of soon here. The first lesson is that the philosophical debate about meta-analysis really should, I think, ask a different question. So I think it's fair to say, since Stiganga published his paper in 2011 criticizing meta-analysis, that's kind of been the question that most even of the philosophical work on meta-analysis is asking. It just doesn't seem like the most interesting or productive question to ask. The better question is, how should we reason about natural phenomena on the basis of meta-analytic results? And that may happen in a lot of different ways. So I've given you a couple of other ways to reason about natural phenomena on the basis of meta-analytic results in the talk. There may well be more. I don't claim to have done that exhaustively. I'm just trying to motivate this broader view, but I hope you've seen how the second question is far better than the first one. There's a lot more scope there. We can understand scientific practice better. We may even be able to improve scientific practice by asking that question, as opposed to the first one. But what to say about this whole problem of arbitrariness in meta-analysis, right? So that comes to lesson 2, that we should expect meta-analytic results to vary. And I think there's 2 kind of slightly different points to make here. The first one is, it's not clear this is a special problem for meta-analysis, right? There's this large literature on values in science that focuses on unforced value judgments, methodological choices that scientists make that can affect the outcomes of their studies. If you thought that was a general thing for science, of course you would find this in meta-analysis too. I guess that's sort of too bad for people who thought anyone could do a meta-analysis and get the exact same answer, because it's a bit like doing long division. But short of having that really, really naive view about what it is, the fact that there are judgment calls that could affect the results of science in a meta-analysis is not a disaster. It's in fact the thing we would expect based on our larger analysis of science. So if the people in this debate want to make the case that there's a real problem for meta-analysis. It's really bad. They have to kind of start saying something different. Say something like the nature of the unforced choices in a meta-analysis is somehow worse than the situation in science more generally, which is an argument that could be made, but not an argument I've seen people make yet, because they're sort of focused just on there's arbitrariness, which is not, there's places we can go from here. Second thing to say is that this is a little more tentative. I came to this more recently, but that meta-analytic reporting practices seem like they are really rooted in the standard story about meta-analysis. But there's reason to think that there are different ways to report the results of meta-analyses that might actually reduce some of the conflict among them. So in the last couple of years, people had advanced this sort of hypothesis about the video game case. So on one way of looking at the video game case, where everyone's really focused on the effect sizes and what's significant and what's not, all the studies disagree. On another way of looking at it, even the studies that disagree may seem to have a lot in common. So if that's right, the people who made the case for this basically say if you're not exclusively focusing on the meta-analytic mean and its so-called statistical significance, if you're open to other ways of reporting, you can see that no matter who does the meta-analysis, in the majority of studies, most effect sizes are greater than 0. So there's some effect size of video games on violent or aggressive behavior, but most of these effects are very, very small, negligible. Like, they're there, but they're barely there, right? So there's sort of a way to bring a rapprochement to this debate if these people are correct, which I think nicely falls out of abandoning this standard story about meta-analysis. Okay, very last thing, lesson 3, and then I'll wrap up here. This is maybe the one I'm most excited about. I think there's a world of possible epistemic costs and benefits to do with meta-analysis that philosophers, especially people who do social epistemology, social structure of science, could explore more fully. So those same ecologists and biologists who I quoted earlier as talking about variety being the spice of life, they're also very excited about this thing that they have named terribly effective thinking. Terrible name, interesting idea. Their thought is all these studies in ecology that sort of just report a significant result or not based on the p-value, that's kind of frustrating. What will be so much better is if all of the people who did these studies imagined that the ultimate destiny for their study was that it would someday be brought into a bigger meta-analysis, and that would give us an estimate of an effect size that was sort of not all about the statistical significance of a particular study, because that is so affected by study design, sampling size. We want to transcend that by pooling all the studies on a question. We'll be thinking about effect sizes. That's why they call it effective thinking. So that's kind of a radical proposal, right? It's this, we should all be doing our research, not because we have that much optimism about what any particular study will tell us, but because how can we collate it with other research in the future? Do we want that in our science? How good of an idea is that? How bad of an idea is that? How should we make decisions? It seems like if everyone sort of got on board with doing meta-analyses so that they could be easily, or doing primary studies, so they could be easily combined into a meta-analysis, that will privilege certain ways of doing things, certain ways of asking questions over others, right? So this very, very sketchy here because I'm mindful of the time, but this seems like a perfect place for philosophers to spend a lot more time considering what happens when science runs this way versus that way, and how excited we are about doing it one way versus another. Okay. The last thing I'll say, this is not a substantive point, but it's a point that I think is really worth making at the end here. I said that I'm just trying to tell a second story, not necessarily build it up from scratch. I really think there have been all along over the past 50 years at least hints of this way of thinking about meta-analysis, even though it's been overlooked by philosophers. So to really bring that point home, I'm just going to end on a beautiful passage from the original Gene Glass paper in 1976, which makes me suspect he actually kind of understood all of this perfectly. He writes, "No educational problem admits a single answer. We study a system and a process, too complex, and too interactive to give up its secrets so easily. The variance in our findings of studies is essential, largely irreducible. It should be viewed as something to be studied in its own right. So I hope you agree with Jean Glass, I hope you agree with me, but I'm looking forward to questions.